one of our best sources of information about the Sumerian gods, is a book called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is sometimes called the first book, or the oldest book. Probably not the first book, but certainly a very old book, and at least one of the earliest books that we've been able to find. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Epic is a fancy word that means a long poem, and that's how the story is told, as a long poem. Gilgamesh is the lead character in the poem. The Epic of Gilgamesh survives in part today. We don't have all of it. It survives on clay tablets. The last time I checked, there were 17 of these tablets that we've been able to find. I'm trying to show you a photograph of one. There we go. Here's a photograph of one of the clay tablets. You can see some places where the story is missing off of the tablets, where the stone has not been found yet. Let's be hopeful. Okay. And another of the tablets where obviously some of the story has been lost to us, at least for now. I'll go back to the previous picture for you. If I can get my cursor to work. There we go. Just to look at it. The Sumerians wrote on clay tablets. We'll be talking about Sumerian writing in a later lecture. Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the king of the city of Uruk. That's a major Sumerian city, one of the most powerful of the city-states in Sumer. You see where Uruk is in Sumer, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You may be able to make out on the map. So there's that city. The city of Uruk, very famous city. It's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament in the early chapters of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrews call it Erech. According to the Old Testament, it was built by a man named Nimrod. The Arabic name for Uruk is Iraq. That's why Iraq is called Iraq. It's named after Uruk, the city which, according to the story, Gilgamesh was once the king of. He was a very powerful king, not a very good king in a moral sense. There are two different traditions of the story, okay, on the tablets we've been able to find. In one of them, Gilgamesh is just said to oppress the people. In the other tradition, he's said to rape the women in the city, just nearly constantly. Well, whether we have take the more generic oppression or the more specific horrible story, the women in the city decide to take care of Gilgamesh. So they hire the town prostitute, Shamhat, or one of the town prostitutes, I guess. It's a big city. I mean, I should have more than one, I'm pretty sure. Shamat, to go out and meet Enkidu. Enkidu is a wild man. He's described as half animal and half man, not in a literal sense like a minotaur or something, or a centaur or something like that, or a mermaid, something like that. Not that sense, but he's a half man, half animal. He's like a man, but he lives with the animals. He lives with the beasts in the forests, in the fields. He's a wild man. Well, Shamhat goes out and meets Enkidu. They have sex. The story is very explicit here, much more explicit than I'm going to be. They have sex for 6 days and 6 nights, which pretty impressive. And at the end of that time, Enkidu goes back into the woods, back into the forest, back into the swamplands, and the animals want nothing more to do with him. And Shamhat says, "Why don't you come back to Uruk and fight Gilgamesh and become the king of the city?" So Enkidu comes back to the city, or for the first time goes to the city of Uruk, and challenges Gilgamesh to a fight. Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight with each other, but neither one can defeat the other, so at the end of the day, they shake hands and decide to become good friends. And they become great friends. And they decide to set off on some adventures together. They have a number of adventures. They go to the, what's it called? The Great Cedar, Great Cedar Forest. There's another name for it. Slips my mind. It doesn't matter. They chop down a cedar tree. It's a big adventure for these guys, you know. Well, they chop down a sacred cedar tree. I should have added that part. And so the gods send send a dream to Enkidu that that they're going to send the bull of heaven to kill them, to punish them. But instead, Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull of heaven, and so Enkidu is sent another dream that one of them is going to die, and in fact it's Enkidu who becomes ill and dies. Well, Gilgamesh's best friend is dead, and Gilgamesh realizes really for the first time that someday he's going to die, because that's what happens to everybody. And he wants to find the secret of immortality, the secret of eternal life. Well, as he travels around looking for this secret, he meets all kinds of interesting people. They all have an interesting story to tell. They all ask Gilgamesh questions, and and of course they ask questions about Gilgamesh questions about what life is like back in Sumer. And as Gilgamesh answers these questions, then we learn about life in Sumer. Okay. But of course, one thing they want to know is, what kind of gods do you have back where you come from? We know what kind of gods we have, but what kind of gods do you have? And one of the first things we learn about the Sumerian gods is that the gods are mean. Man, are the gods mean. Mean, mean, mean. If you wanted one word to describe the Sumerian gods, it would be mean. Really mean. They're never nice to you. They never do anything much to help you. Sometimes they'll pretend to help you, but if a god shows up and acts like they want to help you, then watch your back, because he's going to play a trick on you. You're going to get it. One way or the other, you're going to get it. Nothing ever works out well for these people. Okay, these are mean, mean, mean gods. And at one point, someone says, "Man, your gods are mean. What's the meanest thing that your gods ever did to you?" And Gilgamesh begins to tell a story. He says, it's one of our first stories about the gods. It's a very early story. In fact, it's so early that it didn't even happen in Sumer. It happened back when the gods and the people used to live up in the mountains to the north of Sumer. The gods had created the people up there. This is a story which is told in more detail in another Sumerian book called the Enuma Elish. It's the Sumerian creation story. There, the gods, it's a terrible story. It's a highly dysfunctional family of gods who can't get along with each other, and they fight over who's going to do all the work. And so they decide to create human beings to do all the work instead of the gods. And so they create human beings. They make them out of clay, and they become alive. And so the gods have created the humans up there. Well, now back to the Gilgamesh story here. The people have asked Gilgamesh, "What's the worst thing your gods ever did to you?" And Gilgamesh says, "Oh, that one's easy." He says, "This is an old story. It took place all the way up in the mountains. Well, one night, the gods are asleep, trying to get to sleep, on top of the mountains." By the way, Sumerian polytheism is pretty typical. It's pretty typical. It's pretty typical in polytheism for the gods to be mean. I know there are exceptions, but that's pretty typical for the gods to be mean. All right. In fact, we'll talk about an exception in a polytheistic system. But it's pretty typical. All right. And it's also very typical in a polytheistic system for the gods to live on top of mountains. In fact, if you ever find a polytheistic system where there are mountains around, the gods live on top of the mountains. That's just pretty standard. Well, one night, the gods are trying to get to sleep in their spirit houses on top of the mountains. But the people who live down the valley are having a big party, and they're making lots of noise. I used to live in that apartment complex, so I can identify with the gods here. Okay. Well, the gods are tossing and turning on their spirit beds, cussing out the people down in the valley, and noise just keeps getting louder and louder. The party keeps going on and on and on and on and on. And one of the gods hollers over and says, "Hey, you, the god who can make it rain anytime she wants to. Snap your fingers 3 times and make it rain, and flood out the valley and kill all the people down there." And the god who can make it rain anytime she wants to says, that's a good idea. And so she snaps her fingers 3 times, or whatever, and it starts to rain. It rains so long that not only is the valley flooded, but the entire world is covered with water, and all the human beings are killed. Except for this one guy, who had built a boat in his backyard. His name is Utnapishtim. He built a great big boat in his backyard. One of the gods, Ea, that's just spelled E-A, not a big deal, who sometimes, if there's one god who sometimes is kind of nice, maybe, it's Ea. And Ea comes down a little bit before this night and says, you know, the gods are really getting upset at you people, you better build a big boat. And so Utnapishtim builds this big boat. Anyway, it starts to rain. And Utnapishtim says, aha, I think maybe I know what that big boat is for. So he gets 2 of every kind of animal he can find. And him and his family, and they get in this boat. And sure enough, the boat comes in handy. The flood waters start to rise, and the boat starts to lift off of its supports, and it goes floating off. It floats around for a long time. And Utnapishtim begins to think, you know, the flood waters came up. They got to go down sometime. So he begins sending out a bird every day, a raven every day. And one day, every day. And so the raven flies out and flies around in the air and then comes back to the boat. And this happens until one day the raven comes back with a twig, a green twig with leaves on it in its mouth. And Utnapishtim says, aha, there's land somewhere. And so he kind of steers over to where the raven was, and they bump into the top of a mountain, and eventually the flood waters go down. So, as it turns out, not all the human beings are killed, but just about. If it hadn't been for this guy and his crazy boat, all the human beings, and all the animals for that matter, would have been killed. A lot of similarities, of course, to the Noah flood story, which we find in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. You may be familiar with that story, even down to the story of the bird flying around every day until it comes back with a twig in its mouth. But a lot of differences as well. And probably the most important difference is that outside of this one god who sneaks down and tells Utnapishtim to build the boat, there's no good guys among the gods, okay? I mean, this is pretty mean. To destroy the human race so we can get a good night's sleep. To kill everybody because it's too noisy. Isn't that a bit self-centered? Maybe a bit of an overreaction? Destroy the human race so I can get a good night's sleep. In the Noah story, the concern is with morality. The people are being immoral. They're being bad people. The gods are not concerned about bad people. They're concerned about noisy people. A significant difference. We'll get to the Hebrew people and their emphasis on morality when we get to them. But a lot of similarities, of course, between this Gilgamesh flood story, we'll call it, and the Noah flood story. Well, back to the Gilgamesh story, just to wrap up the story so you understand how it works. Gilgamesh wants to find out the secret of immortality. And so he visits the only person who is immortal, and that is Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh goes to meet him. You see, the gods, after they found out that Utnapishtim and his family had survived and the human race hadn't been destroyed, they punished him. They punished him with eternal life, immortality. Think about it. Would you want to live to be 35,000 years old? Think how many wrinkles you would have. How much arthritis would you have if you were 60,000 years old? So Utnapishtim knows the secret of immortality, the secret of eternal life, and he's going to tell Gilgamesh about it.